Good morning. I'm Dr. William Bender, and I appreciate this opportunity to visit with you today. I had hoped to visit Brazil and speak with you personally, but the worldwide pandemic has changed those plans and many others as we all struggle to cope with the realities of our new world. My thoughts and prayers are with the people of Brazil and indeed people worldwide in these difficult times. And perhaps I can visit with you at some future point to discuss project-based learning. Like many of you, I began my professional career teaching students in the public school classrooms, grades 8 and 9, kind of middle school children, and I was teaching students with learning disabilities, emotional disturbance, and behavioral disorders. During those years, I often struggled to find exactly the right type of instructional strategies that would be useful for those kids. They had very diverse needs, and finding something to do with them in the classroom was quite a challenge. I then taught teachers to do the same thing at Rutgers University and the University of Georgia for many years, preparing them to deal with challenging kids. At this point in my career, I've written 34 books, most of those focused on educational strategies for special needs kids and other children. I've done well over 1,000 workshops for teachers in virtually every one of the 50 United States and in the Canadian provinces from Calgary to Newfoundland. I work with the Ministry of Education of Bermuda, and I've worked many times with the Department of Education here in the United States of America. Many of those workshops, as well as many of my books, focused on instructional strategies that work in real-world classrooms, and I do tend to emphasize very practical, research-proven strategies. My most recent books, published only in 2020, explored the most effective instructional strategies for students who have experienced repeated trauma throughout childhood. These kids exposed to various forms of child abuse can be some of the most important, challenging students to teach, and finding effective strategies for them is itself quite a challenge. Now, given all of that work on instructional strategies, today's topic, project-based learning, is one of my favorites because it is one of the most impactful instructional strategies I've ever seen for students across the ability spectrum. My book, Project-Based Learning, was widely used in the United States and Canada and ultimately translated into Portuguese, and I'm very glad it's available to you now in your native language. Project-based learning is best understood as the use of real-world problems to teach academic content in a student-driven, collaborative manner in order to develop a solution to a stated problem or task. Now, I've come to see that project-based learning, this innovative instructional approach, might truly be revolutionary in education. Traditionally, educational content has been summarized by lists or content standards or objectives. These standards represent the actual content that we are supposed to teach in particular grade levels for kids of particular age, whether that be mathematics or science or social studies. These lists of content standards would then become the basis for our curriculum text, and teachers would devise instructional strategies and activities to teach that content. Next, students will be exposed to those curricular activities and then would be assessed on their learning in some way. Now, this has been our traditional instructional approach for many decades, and while this works, it really is more of a 20th century approach to educational activities. In order to conceptualize a 21st century view of learning, we have to ask ourselves, what do young adults truly do in the modern workforce? Now, I know that Brazil is a highly industrialized country, which is the 12th largest economy in the world. You've developed a broad manufacturing base in industry. You're among the largest steel exporters in the world, while agriculture exports and mining were both historically important in your economic development. Today, Brazil is an industrial powerhouse and exports everything from engines to petrochemicals to computers, home appliances, and aircraft. Your projects are shipped worldwide. Now, I'm sure this economic summary is old news to you guys. This is not, but this does provide us with a good place to begin our understanding of project-based learning. Now let's consider the work environment in virtually all of those industries that I've just discussed. In almost all 21st century industries, common goals might be to increase efficiency or improve the work environment. To accomplish these goals, workers might well be asked to sit on a planning committee. Such a group might involve supervisors, laborers, middle management, even senior management working together to devise new or revised approaches to the task at hand, whether that be harvesting corn in a large agribusiness concern or improving computer functioning or development. The type of planning this group would probably undertake involves some of the following types of activities. They might need to initially identify a specific problem to address in the plant or in the manufacturing process. Next, they might brainstorm possible solutions and establish teams to explore those solutions. They would take some time next to research those possible solutions and perhaps model them. They would hypothesize a bit in order to select one or more of those solutions to later implement. And finally, they would implement their solution and evaluate them by asking, did their ideas solve the problem at hand? Now, these attempts to improve our work environment take place all the time, and these tasks provide a basis or can provide a basis for our instructional strategies, specifically project-based learning and instructional practice that is much more relevant to students' learning needs today than the traditional model of instruction that I spoke of earlier. In fact, the steps enumerated above are very similar to the instructional steps in a project-based learning instructional model. In PBL, after a real-world problem has been identified either by the teacher or the students work together to brainstorm solutions for the problem. Then, in a student-directed manner, teams of students will hold a planning meeting during which they identify various topics related to the problem and develop a project timeline. Next, they will divide responsibilities among sub-teams and take some time to research the topic. Then they'll report back in a planning meeting. As this indicates, project-based learning, or PBL, can be rather straightforward. It can take a few class periods for a particular project, but there may be very involved projects that take 2-3 weeks or even longer. After some work, the students will synthesize their research information. They will select a solution from the possible solutions that are still being considered. They will implement that and perhaps develop a product or a webinar or something of those lines. And finally, they'll evaluate their own work to see if they've addressed the issue at hand. During this entire process, the teacher serves more as a learning facilitator rather than a lecturer or a deliverer of content. Here we can see the immediate similarity between project-based learning and the team-based problem solution work in a modern work environment. In fact, it's not unreasonable to suggest that for the nation of Brazil to continue its amazing economic growth of recent decades, implementation of PBL across the nation would better prepare your workforce for the technology and manufacturing needs of future decades. Here's a PBL example that I have had the opportunity to participate in. The Erie Canal in New York State in the United States began in the early 1880s, before railroads existed. The Erie Canal was a commercial canal that connected the Hudson River and the harbor of New York City with the beef, hog, and corn farms of the Great Lakes region of the United States of America. The canal was one factor which made New York City the largest port in the USA in the early 1800s. Now, the canal fell into disuse with the advent of railroads, but part of it ran through a city in New York State, and that small city council wanted to develop a greenway type of park along the canal for folks to walk and stroll and have picnics. So they invited schools in the local area to get involved and suggest ideas. Well, I happened to be doing a series of workshops in that town, a series, I think it was 4 workshops over a period of 2 months with a group of faculty. And as one workshop assignment, one innovative elementary teacher decided to develop a project-based learning experience to address that community need. Now, this teacher was teaching about butterflies, metamorphosis, the life cycle of butterflies from egg to egg to larva to pupa, and finally to the butterfly. As it turned out, their small town was on a butterfly migration route, and the teacher decided to propose a PBL experience for her class. Her driving question was, can we present information on the monarch butterfly in educational displays along the Erie Canal green space? Well, the students fell in love with the project immediately. They brainstormed. They decided to do an educational project to develop 5 large weatherproof displays along that section of the canal, presenting information on the monarch butterfly. They presented its life cycle, its migration routes, coloring, related topics, a number of topics that were well beyond 4th grade level. After some brainstorming, one group of students did a 10-minute proposal of their PBL project to the City Council. That project was approved, and students then went to work. Students brainstormed topics for the signs. They actively researched the information to be presented. They had to plan the sign construction. They identified local businesses who might contribute treated lumber or plastic signs to be mounted on the greenway. They developed sign scripts. They did measurements for the signage. They had to specify a location for the signage. They had to identify people who could actually go out and put the signs in the ground. They had to work with city workers both in presenting to the city council and also the city workforce to find out which laborers in the city planning board would actually go out and install the signage. There were many wonderful outcomes to this project. The project culminated in 6 months with the installation of 6 permanent informational displays along that greenway about the monarch butterfly. A local TV station did a news story on the signs, which excited the students tremendously. The informational content of the signs was far above 4th grade level because the students wanted to make sure that the information was going to apply and inform the public at large. Those signs stand today along that green space. It's a number of years later. Now, we need to reflect on this for a moment to understand project-based learning. Personally, I've been an educator for many, many decades, and I've worked with a number of instructional strategies, but to understand the importance of PBL in this single project, I need to go all the way back to my own 4th grade year in school many decades ago. Well, I'm sure I learned content during that year. I'm sure I did educational activities, perhaps a field trip during that year. I cannot now remember a single task that I did in my 4th grade year. Now, I want you to contrast my 4th grade experience with the experience of these children who, in a PBL project, developed those signs for that green space along the Erie Canal. Those students will remember that activity forever. In future decades, they'll take their own children to that green space along the Erie Canal, and they'll point to that signage and say, we did that. We did that when I was in the 4th grade. We did that in elementary school. And in short, those students will remember that PBL learning experience for their entire life. That is the power of project-based learning. In addition to more memorable learning experiences, there are many other research-proven advantages of project-based learning. Clearly, this is an instructional tool that every educator should be using. Now, one brief video summarizing the research on PBL in a 2nd grade class can be found on this YouTube video. I suggest that you review that video as part of your work preparing for PBL to see a project in an actual classroom. I'll present other suggestions later for various video examples. Now, I mentioned several advantages of PBL already, and many others are shown in the research on project-based learning. PBL best approximates real-world skills, whereas traditional teacher-driven instruction does not really do that. This strategy prepares students for the work environments that they'll face in the coming decades. Next, PBL leads to solutions for real-world problems and needs, and thus learning seems to really make a difference to the students in the class. Project-based learning increases student engagement with learning and often leads to lifelong learning memories. For that reason, the content learned in PBL is remembered for a much longer period of time. Because student engagement is increased in PBL, the strategy also increases student achievement. Research has shown it repeatedly. Project-based learning increases students' competencies as team members, and that is a factor that's critical in all future work environments. Project-based learning allows for student choice among the necessary tasks, and that tends to increase their motivation and their love of learning generally. Now, as we reflect on implementing PBL, the advantages noted here are numerous. However, there are some concerns which I addressed in my book, and we should mention these. First, not all educational content is appropriate for project-based learning. For example, memorization of times tables or specific formulas used in science or math are still based on memorization, and teachers will need to plan specific activities for these types of material, even in a classroom that's predominantly based on project-based learning. Next, the role of the teacher changes in project-based learning from information provider and lesson planner to instructional facilitator. Some teachers experience this as a major transition, and it does take some getting used to. Over time, students will develop more skills in self-direction and become better learners in a PBL environment. As that takes place, teachers will become more comfortable facilitating project-based learning projects also. Next, not all students in the class may be ready for project-based learning at the same time. I taught students of limited ability in special ed classes for many years, and while such students can participate in PBL work, the teacher will probably spend a bit more time directing their work on a more hands-on way, more closely than with other students. In contrast, students with high abilities seem to thrive in a PBL environment. Finally, not all project-based learning projects result in displays in local parks or food gardens for the less fortunate families. As a project which was discussed in my book, sometimes a culminating project for PBL work could be an instructional video posted on YouTube on the culture of indigenous peoples, or a website for information on local floodplains in the area. PBL projects can result in anything that addresses the real-world problem needs, and as such, all types of products are likely to be developed in a project-based learning classroom. Now I'd like to discuss how PBL may fit in various different classes at different grade levels. I provided an elementary grade project previously. Now I'd like to recommend a YouTube video that presents a PBL-based high school example. This 30-minute video focuses on student learning experiences in a high school where project-based learning is used to drive the entire curriculum. In this school, there are no lesson plans. There are no lectures, no teacher-directed instruction, no teacher-led instruction. Rather, project-based learning is used as the basis for all instruction. At this school, individual students create their own projects to address the standards in the curriculum. They present project proposals to their teachers, who they call advisors. And when a project is approved, they undertake the work under advisor guidance. Most students undertake 3 to 5 projects at any given point in time. And as they complete a project, they present the completed PBL project back to their advisors and demonstrate their mastery of specific curricular content standards. I should also point out that in this high school example, most of the projects were individual student projects and not team-based efforts. Of course, implementation of PBL projects vary from one setting to another.
This is the first time they're meeting on these particular projects. A project planning team usually consists of 2 advisors and a student. If it were a group project, then all students involved would be at the table, but these are all individual projects. This is the meeting where the student gets to pitch the idea for the project. Unless the team signs off on your idea, it's back to the drawing board. You give an explanation of what it is you intend to do, and then the team members ask questions. The questions can be about the scope of the project, the type of resources it will require, as well as questions about your personal interest in the topic.
However, the concept of student-driven instruction rather than teacher-delivered instruction is constant in all PBL examples. Now, while it's enlightening to see an example where project-based learning drives the entire school day, This is a rather extreme example. I've included it here in order to show what project-based learning can involve. However, more common applications of PBL involve some combined use of traditional instruction coupled with project-based learning for specific instructional units during the school year. In that manner, teachers can more easily assure that essential content is covered while exposing all students to the increased demands of project-based learning. Again, many examples of project-based learning can be reviewed on YouTube. And here are a couple of other online sources that I recommend to teachers, including Edutopia and the Buck Institute for Education. These can be very helpful. Now, there are many decisions involved in implementation of project-based learning, and only a few of those issues can be presented here. The first implementation suggestion I usually make is to keep it simple to begin with. Rather than an entire school tossing out traditional instruction altogether, I suggest that one or several teachers who wish to do so begin with a few project-based learning projects as an additional class activity, running those projects in parallel with more traditional instruction. In that fashion, both students and teachers can get used to PBL in a slower fashion, and they get used to the new demands and expectations of this instructional strategy. Then, as the advantages of project-based learning in terms of student engagement, motivation, and increased learning become apparent, those teachers can discuss increased implementation with others in the school. Next, teachers should carefully consider the optimal group size for PBL projects. For example, in one YouTube video example from a second grade class, the entire class worked as a project-based learning group on project-based learning together under teacher direction. In middle school, however, perhaps groups of 5 or 6 students would be more appropriate. In that example, a class of 25 students may have 4 or 5 different groups doing the same PBL project independently of each other. Generally, older students can undertake more of the planning and organization that is necessary in PBL projects. And once the students are more used to doing project-based learning, they can work more independently. Next, it is often helpful to brainstorm community resources that might help facilitate project-based learning. Various museums may have alternative reality projects available for the school groups and various hands-on learning activities that can be effective for PBL work. I've actually discussed this option with educators in Brazil who have assured me that such opportunities do exist in your area. Next, I encourage teachers to be specific in the curricular content that the PBL project is designed to cover. Targeting specific content with the driving question in a PBL project during the first project-based learning meeting can steer that project in the right direction. Next, because PBL projects tend to be driven by students, teachers must carefully watch to assure that project-based learning projects are in fact covering all of the necessary content. Additional teacher-directed web quests or worksheets or other work can be added to PBL projects to make certain that all essential content is addressed. Next, I suggest that teachers develop methods to evaluate students in terms of the team-based collaborative skills that they will need for project-based learning. While modern workplace environments demand team skills, this is a curricular area that has not traditionally been stressed or assessed in our traditional models of instruction. It is advantageous that PBL stresses these collaborative skills, and teachers can add to that emphasis by having some type of peer-based evaluation of each student's collaborative skills and abilities. Students will likewise value these collaborative skills if they see that teachers and peers are evaluating them on those skills. Next, teachers should observe either locally or via video examples a variety of classrooms where PBL has been implemented. While I realize that these video examples would need to be translated into your own language, I did want to present a list of videos and websites that I typically recommend for teachers This list will also be presented at the end of the video in a little bit lengthier fashion so that you can take a look at it then. Finally, I urge teachers to prepare for flexibility in your PBL projects. Some projects will succeed beyond your wildest dreams in motivating students or opening up reluctant learners. Other projects will not work out as well and will require substantial modification during the project itself, particularly when you're beginning the PBL process and student and teachers are still getting used to this mode of learning. As teachers and students become more used to it, this lifelong model of learning and the overall success of PBL will work to improve student learning over time. In closing, I'd like to compliment you on your efforts toward project-based learning. As we've discussed, this is the best fit instructional approach for workplaces in today's modern economies, and the teamwork and collaborative skills stressed in this strategy are ones that kids fall in love with. I recommend this to you and look forward to perhaps working with you again on project-based learning as you make the move toward this exciting instructional emphasis in Brazil. This transition to PBL will involve some work for you, but the payoff is tremendous for both teachers and students, all of whom seem to really enjoy project-based learning. Now, I wish for you the most effective conference and all the best. Thank you.